Some stories are hidden in plain sight. You walk by them unaware of the secrets they carry, the quiet tragedies brewing behind the most respectable doors. This is one of those stories. It is the story of the Gaither family legacy, a lineage built on strict morality and unwavering pride, shattered in a way no one could have predicted. It began with something so ordinary, a family visit. Two athletic, teenage boys sent to spend 2 weeks with their grandmother while their parents were away on assignment. It was meant to be a chance to share memories and reconnect in the silence of a long empty home. But in that house, something else was waiting, a vulnerability born of 10 years of solitude that no one saw coming. Welcome to Crime Obsession. A huge thank you to my subscribers for your continued support as we grow. We are dedicated to bringing you the best told and untold crime stories every single day. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe. The silence in Sadie Gaither's home was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a thick velvet shroud that had settled over the crown molding and into the floorboards since the day Jonas was laid to rest. For over a decade, Sadie had lived in the shadow of that absence, moving through the expansive rooms of her house like a ghost of the woman she once was. Jonas had been her rock, the steady hand that kept the world upright even when the winds of life threatened to pull them off course. Together, they had built a fortress of a life, one anchored by children, shared memories, and a reputation for integrity that was respected by the entire community. But when Jonas passed away, the fortress became a prison of quiet, and the woman known for her resilience began to wither in the solitude. Sadie was now in her late 60s, a woman who still carried herself with the poised, upright posture instilled in her since childhood. She had been raised in a household governed by the iron laws of morality and family values. Her parents were not people of half measures. They taught her from a young age that a family's name was its most precious currency and that integrity was a shield one never set down. She had carried these lessons as if they were sacred relics, through her marriage, through the raising of her daughter Kimberly, and through the quiet years of her early widowhood. To Sadie, the line between right and wrong was not a blurry suggestion. It was a cliff edge, and she had spent her whole life making sure she never stood too close to it. However, loneliness is a patient and insidious force. It does not storm the gates of a moral life all at once. Instead, it waits in the corners of a big empty house, whispering in the middle of the night when the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. As the years dragged on, Sadie's vibrant social life, once filled with church functions, neighborhood gatherings, and family dinners, began to dry up like a parched creek bed. She found herself spending her days in a residence that felt far too large for one person, her only companions being the memories of a man who was never coming back. In that profound isolation, the firm sense of righteousness she had inherited from her parents began to lose its sharp edges. She would often sit in Jonas's favorite leather armchair, staring at the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun, wondering if this was all that remained of a life lived by the rules. The solitude created a vulnerability that Sadie was too proud to admit, even to herself. She hungered for a voice to answer hers, for the sound of footsteps that weren't her own, and for the feeling of being seen by someone other than her reflection in the hallway mirror. She was a woman of strength, yes, but even the strongest foundation can develop cracks when the earth beneath it shifts through years of neglect. The memory of Jonas served as both a comfort and a haunting reminder of what she had lost. She could still see him standing by the window, his hand resting on her shoulder, his presence making her feel entirely safe. He had been a man of immovable principles, the very embodiment of the morality her parents had taught her. Now, in her late 60s, Sadie felt the weight of trying to maintain that standard alone. It was exhausting to be the keeper of a flame when the house was so cold. The values of her upbringing told her to find contentment in her memories and her legacy, but the human heart is a rebellious thing. It does not care for legacy when it is starving for connection. As she moved through her daily routines, the precise making of the bed, the solitary cup of tea, the evening walk to the edge of the property, she felt as though she was performing a play for an audience that had long since gone home. She was still Sadie Gaither, the pillar of the family, the woman of integrity, but beneath the surface, the hunger for companionship was becoming a roar that drowned out the quiet lessons of her youth. She didn't realize it yet, But the fortress she had lived in for so long was no longer protecting her. It was merely hiding the slow erosion of her soul. The announcement of the upcoming visit from her grandsons, Daryl and Nicholas, felt like a reprieve from a life sentence. She hadn't seen them in years, not since they were small children who looked at her with wide-eyed innocence. To Sadie, they represented a chance to reclaim a piece of her former self, to bring the sounds of youth and life back into the tomb she called a home. She envisioned a few weeks of baking, sharing stories of Jonas, and fulfilling the role of the doting grandmother her parents would have expected her to be. She was prepared to be the teacher of the very values she had been raised with, unaware that her own grip on those values was far more fragile than she dared to believe. She spent the days before their arrival cleaning rooms that were already spotless, her heart racing with a nervous energy she hadn't felt in a decade. She wanted everything to be perfect for the boys, to show them the strength and pride of the Gaither name. But as she stood in the doorway of the guest room, smoothing the sheets, she caught a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror. She saw a woman who was tired of being a monument to the past. She was ready for something to change, for the silence to be broken, never imagining that the boys who were coming to save her from her loneliness would be the ones to lead her into a darkness from which there was no return. The professional world of Kimberly McPherson and Jonah Allen was one of constant motion, defined by the rigid demands of international diplomacy and the relentless pace of global assignments. Their lives were a carefully orchestrated sequence of travel, duty, and high-stakes negotiations that often required them to be away for weeks at a time. Usually, they managed the friction between their careers and their family life by staggering their departures, ensuring that at least one parent remained a steady anchor for their 17-year-old sons, Daryl and Nicholas. But the latest directive from the department had changed the landscape entirely. A special assignment had emerged overseas that required both of them to be present for a critical 14-day window. It was a professional opportunity that neither could decline, yet it left them with a domestic puzzle that felt increasingly difficult to solve. In the past, they had relied on a network of trusted caregivers or close friends to watch over the boys, but the twins were no longer children who could be easily managed by a nanny. At 17, Daryl and Nicholas had grown into bold young men, accustomed to a level of independence that came from being the sons of traveling diplomats. They were used to pushing boundaries and navigating the world with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. As Kimberly and Jonah sat in their sun-drenched kitchen, surrounded by travel itineraries and briefing folders, the conversation inevitably turned back to the only viable option remaining: Kimberly's mother, Sadie Gaither. On the surface, the choice was beyond reproach. Sadie lived in a spacious, quiet home that had once been a sanctuary for Kimberly herself. It seemed like the perfect setting for the twins to reconnect with their grandmother, a woman they hadn't seen in years but who had played such a pivotal role in Kimberly's own upbringing. Jonah was quick to champion the idea, seeing it as a dual victory, a way to ensure the boys were supervised by family and a chance to pull Sadie out of the crushing isolation that had defined her life since Jonas's passing. He spoke of the Gaither integrity and the strong moral values Sadie would reinforce, arguing that 2 weeks under her roof would be a stabilizing influence for their spirited sons. Yet, despite the logic of the plan, a cold thread of apprehension wound its way through Kimberly's thoughts. She loved her mother deeply, but their relationship was a complex tapestry of affection and distance, woven from years of unspoken tensions and the weight of Sadie's uncompromising strictness. Sadie had raised Kimberly with the same ironclad moral code her own parents had instilled, a discipline so rigid it had left invisible scars Kimberly still carried into adulthood. As she looked at the photos of her sons, tall, athletic, and increasingly defiant, she felt an instinctive dread she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that she didn't trust her mother, it was that she knew the power of the loneliness Sadie had endured for over a decade. Kimberly stood by the window, watching the late afternoon light hit the trees, and felt a small, persistent voice in the back of her mind telling her that this was the wrong choice. There was something about the timing, about the raw energy of her sons and the hollowed-out vulnerability of her mother, that felt like an unstable chemical reaction waiting for a spark. She remembered the way Sadie had looked during their last brief visit. Still poised, yes, but with a lingering sadness in her eyes that seemed to have deepened into something more profound than mere grief. The idea of leaving two reckless, boundary-testing teenagers in that environment started to feel less like a visit and more like a catalyst for trouble. Jonah, sensing her hesitation, reached out and took her hand, his voice a soothing counterpoint to her inner storm. He reminded her that Sadie was the one who had taught her about the ties that bind, and that family was the only true safety net they had. He convinced her that they were overthinking the situation, that the boys would likely just spend their time on their phones or exploring the local area, and that Sadie would thrive with a renewed sense of purpose. Under the pressure of the impending flight and the lack of alternatives, Kimberly began to suppress her intuition, labeling it as the irrational anxiety of a mother leaving her children for the first time in months. She tried to rationalize the decision by focusing on the positives. It was only 2 weeks, she told herself. What could possibly happen in 14 days that could unravel a lifetime of family values? She imagined the twins helping Sadie with the garden or listening to her stories about Jonas, envisioning a wholesome return to the Gaither roots. She pushed down the memory of how bold Daryl and Nicholas had become, how they walked through the world as if rules were mere suggestions, and how Sadie, in her solitude, might be far more fragile than the monument of strength she projected. The decision was finalized with a phone call to Sadie, whose voice sparked with a rare, bright excitement at the prospect of the visit. Hearing her mother's joy briefly silenced Kimberly's doubts, making her feel as though she was doing something genuinely good for both generations. They began the process of packing the boys' bags and finalizing the travel arrangements to Sadie's house. Yet, as Kimberly closed her suitcase the night before their departure, the uneasy feeling returned, a heavy knot in the pit of her stomach that no amount of logic could untie. She didn't know then that she was walking away from a family she knew for the last time, and that the 2 weeks she had dismissed as a short interval would be the time in which her world would be changed forever. The arrival of Daryl and Nicholas Allen was not a subtle entry into the quietude of Sadie Gaither's home. It was a physical disruption that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the estate. When they stepped through the front door, the silence that Sadie had cultivated for over a decade did not just break, it shattered. Sadie stood in the foyer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, prepared to greet the small children she still carried in her mind's eye. Instead, she was met by 2 young men who stood nearly a head taller than her, their presence filling the entryway with an energy that felt foreign and overwhelming. They were 17 now, their bodies having transitioned into a lean, athletic maturity that Sadie found herself entirely unprepared for. Their hair was styled in long, intricate locks that framed faces possessing a bold, striking confidence, a sharp departure from the soft features of the grandson she had once known. Daryl and Nicholas did not wait for an invitation to make themselves at home. They moved through the foyer with a casual, almost predatory ease, their heavy duffel bags thudding against the polished hardwood floors. There was no hesitation in their movements, no sense of the reverence for the Gaither integrity that Kimberly and Jonah had hoped would be reinforced. Instead, they brought with them the habits of a life lived with too much independence and too little supervision. As they began to unpack and settle into the guest wing, the atmosphere of the house underwent a profound shift. The air, which had once felt still and cool, now felt thick and heavy, charged with the restless spirit of 2 young men accustomed to pushing boundaries and testing the world around them. It was within the first few hours that the first wave of Sadie's discomfort truly took root. As the afternoon heat began to settle into the house, the twins stripped away the layers of their travel clothes. Sadie, coming down the hall to offer them a snack, stopped short at the sight of them lounging in the living room. They were dressed in tight, revealing athletic wear, their bare chests on display as they sprawled across the antique furniture that Jonas had once meticulously cared for. Their skin glistened in the sunlight, and the way they carried themselves, so comfortable and unbothered in their own bodies, sent a jolt through Sadie that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't just their size or the boldness of their gaze. It was the way they walked through her home as if they already owned it, their presence a constant, vibrating reminder of the youth and vitality she had lacked for so long. Sadie found herself averting her eyes, her heart fluttering with a nervous agitation that felt like a betrayal of her own strict upbringing. She had been raised to value modesty and decorum, yet here were her own grandsons, flaunting a physicality that felt almost aggressive in its confidence. She tried to steady her voice as she asked them to put on shirts, to remember the rules of the house, But they only laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to mock the formal boundaries she was trying to set. They shrugged off her requests with a casual indifference, their eyes meeting hers with a knowingness that made her feel suddenly and acutely vulnerable. She told herself it was just boys being boys, a phrase she clung to like a life raft. But deep down, she knew that something in the house had already moved beyond her control. As the first evening descended, the physical reality of having men in the house became an unavoidable weight. Every sound seemed amplified, the heavy tread of their footsteps on the stairs, the low rumble of their voices from behind closed doors, the rhythmic thud of a basketball against the driveway outside. Sadie found herself sitting in her usual chair, but she was no longer alone with her memories of Jonas. The silence she had once found so suffocating now felt like a lost sanctuary. She could feel their presence through the walls, a magnetic force that pulled at her attention no matter how hard she tried to focus on her book or her needlework. The discomfort she felt was not merely about their clothing or their volume. It was the way they looked at her, not as a grandmother to be revered, but with a bold curiosity that felt dangerous. They would catch her eye and smile, a playful yet deliberate expression that made her chest tighten with guilt and confusion. She felt as though she were being watched in her own home, observed by two young men who understood her vulnerability far better than she did herself. The shadows of her past, the strict lessons of her parents and the principled life of her husband, seemed to recede in the face of this new, vibrant reality. Sadie realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the 2 weeks Kimberly had promised would be a simple visit were already becoming something far more complicated. The house was no longer a monument to the past. It had become a stage for attention she was not prepared to handle, and the boys in the guest room were no longer children, but the catalysts for a storm she could already feel brewing in the heavy summer air. The heavy, humid air of the following days seemed to settle into the very pores of the house, bringing with it a psychological weight that Sadie Gaither found increasingly difficult to lift. As Daryl and Nicholas entrenched themselves in the guest wing, the initial shock of their arrival evolved into a persistent, gnawing awareness of her own isolation. The twins were no longer the manageable children she had once cared for. They were young men, bold and confident in their bodies in a way that took Sadie by surprise. She found herself constantly acknowledging that they were no longer the boys of her memory, but attractive men who moved with a casual grace that made her own skin feel suddenly too tight. This recognition was a poison that began to fester, making her question the very foundation of her identity as a grandmother and a woman of principle. Loneliness, she realized, was a powerful force that did not just whisper in the dark, it roared in the presence of vitality. Sitting alone in her kitchen after the boys had retreated to their rooms, Sadie felt the silence of the last 10 years pressing in on her more fiercely than ever before. The presence of Daryl and Nicholas served as a mirror, reflecting the vast, empty spaces in her life that she had tried so hard to ignore. She had spent a decade sleeping in a bed that once held two, keeping her husband's memory alive like a flickering candle, but the warmth of that memory was no match for the living, breathing energy now vibrating through her hallways. She found herself caught in an internal battle, wanting to be the loving grandmother who provided a moral compass, yet feeling the lines between right and wrong beginning to blur under the weight of her own desperate need for connection. The twins seemed to intuitively sense the shift in the atmosphere. They continued to lounge about the house in their revealing clothing, their bare chests and athletic frames a constant, unavoidable sight that kept Sadie's heart in a state of perpetual agitation. When she would attempt to set boundaries or ask them to cover up, they would offer a playful smile or a lingering look that felt far too casual to be innocent. She told herself it was her own mind slipping into places it had no right to be, but the more time she spent with them, the harder it became to maintain the distance her upbringing demanded. Every time Nicholas would walk past her, his shoulder brushing hers, or Daryl would catch her eye with a knowing smirk, the strict moral values her parents had instilled felt like they were eroding under a relentless tide. She began to spend more time observing them from a distance, her eyes drifting toward them even when she tried to focus on her books. She watched the way they carried themselves, the way they seemed so comfortable in their skin, and she felt a terrifying attraction growing within her, a desire she wasn't ready to confront and one that terrified her. These were her grandsons, the blood of her daughter, yet the loneliness was proving to be a stronger force than her sense of family duty. The conflict grew heavier with every passing day, as the woman she had once been, the proud mother and the devoted wife, began to feel like a stranger to the woman currently watching the twins move through her home. She would lie awake at night, the ceiling of her bedroom a blank canvas for her racing thoughts, wondering if it was already too late to turn back. The memory of Jonas would surface, his principled face a silent reproach in her mind, but the reality of her solitude was a more immediate and crushing burden. She questioned if the strictness of her past had left her ill-equipped for the hunger of her present. The Gaither integrity that her husband had exemplified now felt like a heavy cloak she was no longer strong enough to wear. She was drowning in a sea of emotions she couldn't control, and the boys were the only solid thing she could see, even if reaching for them meant destroying everything she had ever built. As she prepared breakfast or folded their laundry, she found herself lingering over the small details of their presence. The scent of their cologne, the sound of their laughter, the sight of their discarded clothes. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary of memory. It felt like a prison where the secrets were already beginning to take root in the shadows. She was terrified of what she was becoming, but she was equally terrified of the silence that would return when they left. The lines she had trusted all her life were unraveling in ways she never expected, and as she looked at her grandsons, she realized the nightmare was no longer a distant possibility. It was already beginning to unfold in the very heart of her home. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the silence in the dining room was so heavy it felt nearly suffocating. The usual sounds of a household, the light chatter and easy laughter, had vanished, replaced by the rhythmic, hollow clink of silverware against china. Sadie Gaither could barely bring herself to look up from her plate, the overwhelming shame of her thoughts from earlier that evening weighing on her like a physical leaden vest. She felt the gaze of the twins on her, a constant pressure that made her hands tremble slightly as she moved her fork. Every moral lesson her parents had ever taught her, every memory of Jonas's unwavering integrity, seemed to be screaming at her from the shadows of the room, yet their voices were becoming faint, drowned out by the thrumming of her own pulse. As the meal progressed, the air in the room seemed to grow even thicker with an unspoken intent. Daryl, sitting directly beside her, shifted in his chair, and she felt the warmth of his leg as it brushed against hers under the table. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Sadie that made her heart leap in her chest with terrifying force. She froze, her breath hitching as she tried to tell herself it was merely an accident, a byproduct of three people sharing a table that had once been Jonas's domain. But the contact did not break. Instead, Daryl reached out, his hand finding her arm. It began as a soft touch, almost tentative, but it lingered there, resting gently on her skin in a way that shattered any remaining illusion of grandmotherly comfort. In that moment, Sadie's world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't the touch of a grandson seeking a grandmother's affection. It was something else entirely, something that sent a visceral shiver down her spine and made the room feel suddenly, dangerously small. Her mind, the part of her still tethered to her strict upbringing and the memory of her husband, screamed at her to pull away, to stand up and end this before the last boundary of her life was crossed. She knew that if she didn't act now, there would be no going back. But she remained motionless, her arm resting where it was, her skin tingling under the heat of his fingers. Everything she had spent decades suppressing, the decade of loneliness, the starvation for connection, the vulnerability of a woman left in an empty house, came crashing to the surface with a force that made her vision blur. Nicholas, watching the scene from across the table, did not speak, but the change in his expression was unmistakable. He noticed the shift in Sadie, the way her resistance was crumbling into a sea of confusion and desire. He stood up slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound that felt like a final warning. He walked around the table with a deliberate, slow pace until he was standing directly behind her chair. Sadie felt his presence before she saw him, a magnetic force that overwhelmed her senses and made the moral compass she had followed her whole life spin wildly out of control. Without a single word, Nicholas wrapped his arms around her shoulders. It was a gesture that, in any other context, should have been innocent, perhaps even comforting, but the way his body pressed against hers was an open defiance of every rule they shared. Sadie did not move. She did not push him away or demand they stop. She couldn't. The control she had prided herself on for 60 years had slipped through her fingers like sand. The lines between right and wrong, between family and forbidden, were no longer just blurred, they had been completely erased. As Nicholas's arms tightened slightly around her and Daryl's hand remained firm on her arm, Sadie realized with a sickening sense of finality that the person she used to be was gone. The woman of morality and integrity had fallen, seduced by a desperate need to feel something other than the cold silence of her own life. She knew in the deepest part of her soul that this was no longer about family. It was something darker, a path she could never have imagined walking. The weight of the secret they now shared began to take root in the room, a poison that would soon seep into every corner of the house. As she sat there, surrounded by the twins, she understood that the affair had truly begun, and with it, the countdown to a tragedy that would end in blood. The days that followed the dinner were a blur of confusion and desire, as the initial moment of lost control spiraled into a secret that Sadie Gaither could no longer escape. The house, once a sanctuary of memory and strict moral values, transformed into a place of hidden corners and muffled whispers where the boundaries of family were systematically dismantled. Sadie, who had spent her entire life as a pillar of integrity, now found herself drowning in a sea of emotions she could not govern, her once firm sense of right and wrong swallowed by a force far darker than she ever anticipated. The twins, Daryl and Nicholas, having identified their grandmother's profound vulnerability, did not stop at a single touch. Instead, they pushed further, testing the limits of what they could take from her. What had begun as a fleeting lapse in judgment quickly took root as a toxic relationship, a twisted game where the boys held the reins of power. Daryl and Nicholas were no longer just her grandsons. They became her manipulators, knowing exactly how to keep her bound to them through a calculated mix of affection and control. They whispered things to her that made her feel desired and important, filling the hollow spaces left by 10 years of solitude. But Sadie knew in her heart that these words were a lie designed to keep her trapped. The boys moved through the house with a sense of invincibility, emboldened by the secret they shared, while Sadie felt herself unraveling, replaced by a version of herself she no longer recognized. In the quiet moments when the boys would leave her room or when she found herself staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror, the guilt would return with a suffocating intensity. Memories of Jonas would flood her mind, his principled life a silent, agonizing reproach to her current state. She could see him in the shadows of their shared bedroom, the man she had loved and respected, and the contrast between the life they built and the affair she was currently living felt like a betrayal of the dead. She tried to tell herself that this was a temporary madness that would end the moment the boys left, but the more time they spent together, the more she realized they had taken control of her mind and her emotions. The secret was a fragile thing, held together by a web of lies and constant vigilance. Every time the phone rang with a call from Kimberly, the tension in the house would rise to a breaking point. Sadie would answer with a voice tightened by fear, carefully choosing her words to project an image of normalcy while the boys often lingered nearby, laughing quietly or motioning for her to answer as if daring her to let the truth slip. She would tell Kimberly that everything was fine and that the boys were behaving, each lie feeling like a ticking time bomb that threatened the very foundation of the family she had worked so hard to build. Even simple interactions with neighbors became fraught with danger, as Sadie struggled to maintain her composure at the door, terrified that one wrong word or a single look in her eyes would lay the truth bare. The twins' recklessness only added to the weight of her despair. They were too bold, too sure of themselves, walking around the house with a sense of ownership that bordered on cruelty. They seemed to enjoy the control they exerted over her, pushing her further into the darkness each day. Sadie felt as though she were being consumed by the very loneliness she had sought to escape, finding that the connection she craved was actually a poison seeping into every corner of her life. She would lie awake at night, suffocated by the secret, thinking of how her daughter would react and how the moral compass of the Gaither name was being shattered beyond repair. Despite her internal torment, she could not break free from their toxic grip. The desire they had awakened in her was a powerful destructive force that kept her anchored to the affair. She was caught in a cycle of shame and longing, a sea of confusion where she was slowly drowning. The house that was once a source of pride now felt like a prison with secrets lurking in every shadow. As the days of the visit stretched on, Sadie knew that the facade they were maintaining was unsustainable. The tension was growing, and with it, the terrifying certainty that it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. bringing with it consequences more devastating than any of them could imagine. There are moments in life that shatter everything we believe in, unfolding without warning until the foundations of our world crumble in an instant. For Kimberly McPherson and Jonah Allen, that moment was approaching as they traveled back from their grueling assignment, arriving home far earlier than anyone had expected. They had decided not to call ahead, wanting to surprise Sadie and the boys, eager to reconnect after their long absence. As they pulled into the driveway, an unsettling stillness hung over the property. The house was quiet, too quiet, with no sounds of greeting or the familiar rush of teenage energy to meet them at the door. Kimberly stepped out of the car, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs as an instinctive dread took hold. Something wasn't right. They called out for Daryl, Nicholas, and Sadie as they stepped through the front door, but the only response was the hollow, mocking echo of their own voices. The air in the foyer felt stagnant, almost abandoned, until a faint, barely audible sound drifted down from the upper floor. The unmistakable melody of muffled laughter mingled with the steady, rhythmic rush of running water. Kimberly's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening as she glanced at Jonah. Together, they began to ascend the stairs, their footsteps heavy and deliberate on the hardwood. As they reached the landing, the sounds grew louder, radiating from the master bathroom behind a door that stood slightly ajar. Confusion began to war with the rising pit of dread in Kimberly's stomach as she wondered why they were all in the bathroom together. She called out their names again, her voice louder and more insistent, but the splashing water and the intimate cadence of their voices drowned her out. With a trembling hand, she reached for the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as the portal gave way. The scene that greeted her on the other side was one she could never have prepared for, a tableau of betrayal that defied every moral law she had been raised to honor. Through the thick, roiling clouds of steam that filled the room, she saw them, her 2 sons and her mother, the 3 of them together in the shower in a way that no one could possibly misunderstand. The laughter stopped abruptly, the sound dying in the humid air as Sadie and the boys turned, their eyes wide with a paralyzed shock. For what felt like an eternity, Kimberly stood frozen in the doorway, her mind simply refusing to process the reality of the image before her. The betrayal was too overwhelming, too visceral to comprehend. Her mother, the pillar of integrity, and her sons, the boys she had raised to be men of character, were entwined in a secret so dark it felt like a physical blow to her chest. The silence was shattered as the truth hit Kimberly like a sledgehammer, and her initial shock was instantly consumed by a raw, white-hot rage. This wasn't a mistake or something that could ever be explained away. It was real, and it was happening in the house where she had once felt safe. "What the hell is going on?" she exploded, her voice tearing through the room and cracking the fragile, steamy silence. She didn't wait for an answer or a stuttered justification. She stormed forward, her hands shaking with fury as she grabbed Daryl by the arm and yanked him out of the shower, throwing a towel at him with a snarl. Nicholas was next, dragged out just as forcefully as she screamed at them both to get out. The boys stumbled into the bathroom, too stunned to respond, their faces pale as water dripped from their bodies onto the tile. Jonah stood paralyzed in the doorway, his mind struggling to catch up with the horror unfolding in front of him, his expression one of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Kimberly, however, was far from finished. She turned on Sadie, her voice shaking with a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. She looked at the woman who had raised her, the woman she had trusted with her children, and saw only a stranger shrouded in guilt. Sadie tried to speak, her lips trembling as she struggled to find words that didn't exist. "Kimberly, it's not what you think," she whispered, but the lie only fueled the fire. "Not what I think." Kimberly spat, her voice filled with a venomous contempt that seemed to vibrate through the steam. "You were in there with my sons." The explanation died in Sadie's throat, for there was no justification and no excuse for what had been done. Kimberly's fury was uncontainable, the pain of the betrayal tearing through her very soul. "I trusted you. I trusted you with them," she cried, tears of anger and loss welling in her eyes as the family she thought was whole shattered beyond repair in the middle of that humid room. The air in the master suite was thick, not just with the lingering steam from the bathroom, but with a visceral, suffocating sense of ruin. The bond between mother and daughter, once a steel cable of shared values and unspoken understanding, had been severed in a single jagged instant. Kimberly's heart was no longer a muscle pumping blood. It was a furnace of pure, incandescent rage that left no room for the pleas of the woman standing before her. Sadie stood trembling, her frail frame barely covered by a damp towel, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope that words could somehow mend what had been shattered. But the words she offered, hollow apologies and fractured justifications, were meaningless, spat back at her by a daughter who could no longer recognize the face of her own mother. Jonah finally moved, his voice low and vibrating with a cold, hollow emotion as he ordered Daryl and Nicholas to get dressed. He could not bring himself to look at them, his own sons now strangers to him, marked by a transgression that defied the laws of nature and family. The boys, dazed and pale, hurried from the room with their heads bowed in a shame that had finally found its weight, leaving the two women to face the wreckage alone. "I'm sorry," Sadie whispered again, her voice a fragile reed in the storm of Kimberly's contempt. But Kimberly was already turning away, her mind made up with a finality that felt like a death sentence. "We're leaving," she said, her tone as cold and distant as a winter grave, "and we're never coming back." As Kimberly stormed out of the bathroom and down the hallway, the reality of the abandonment hit Sadie with a force that far outweighed her guilt. The silence of the last 10 years flashed before her eyes, and the prospect of returning to that hollow isolation was more than she could bear. She could not let the last memory they held of her be one of disgust. She had to make them understand. She had to force them to see the woman she used to be behind the shadow of the woman she had become. Panic, sharp and blinding, rose in her throat as she stumbled after them, her wet feet slipping on the hardwood floor as she clutched the towel to her chest. "Kimberly, wait. You don't understand." Sadie cried, her voice cracking with a raw, jagged desperation. She hurried down the hallway, her breathing ragged and thin, her vision blurred by the onset of a hysterical terror. She reached the top of the stairs just as Kimberly and Jonah were halfway down, their footsteps heavy and rhythmic, the sound of their departure a drumbeat of finality. Sadie's heart broke at the sight of their retreating backs, and in her frantic need to stop them, she moved too quickly, too recklessly. Her foot found the edge of the top stair, but the surface was still slick from the dampness of the bathroom, and the grip she sought was simply not there. The fall happened in a horrifying, elongated silence. Sadie's body lurched forward, her arms flailing wildly as she reached for the railing, for a hand, for anything to anchor her to the world. But there was nothing but empty air. She plummeted, her frail frame twisting with a violent, unnatural grace as she tumbled down the steep wooden steps. And then the sound, a sickening, brutal crack as her head struck the edge of a lower stair, echoed through the house like a gunshot, a noise so final it seemed to stop time itself. Sadie's body came to a rest in a heap at the base of the stairs, her form motionless and shattered. Blood, dark and thick, began to pool beneath her head, spreading with a terrifying speed across the floorboards Jonas had once polished with pride. The rage that had filled the house only moments before vanished, replaced by a horror so deep it paralyzed them all. Kimberly was the first to move, her scream of "Mom!" tearing through the stillness as she rushed down the remaining steps to kneel in the growing crimson circle. Her hands trembled as she reached for her mother, her anger gone, replaced by a sheer, soul-crushing terror. By the time the emergency lights flickered against the windows, it was already too late. Sadie Gaither was gone, her last words of regret still hanging in the stagnant air of the home she had destroyed. The investigation would eventually rule the death an accident, a tragic misstep fueled by a family's desperation, but the official report could never capture the truth of the night of blood. The Evans family was left as a collection of shattered remains, forever marked by a tragedy that was not born from the fall itself, but from the secrets that had led them to the edge. The bonds were severed, the trust was dead, and the shadow of Sadie's fall would linger in their minds forever, a constant reminder of how far a family can fall before there is no way back.